Good evening and welcome to the Center for Jewish History. I'm Julie Kaplan, Senior Manager of Programs here at the Center. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's screening of the Holocaust 80 Years On, to be followed by a conversation between Sir Simon Schama and Tina Brown. For those who are not familiar with the Center, we play an important role as a renowned research institute for scholars. The archives of our 5 partner organizations, the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, the Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute, contain the world's largest collection of Jewish historical material outside of Israel. This program is part of a series of public history events that explore how Anne Frank's legacy and the Holocaust more broadly has evolved in both history and memory in connection with Anne Frank the Exhibition, presented by the Anne Frank House at the Center for Jewish History. We are pleased to be partnering with the Yeshiva University Museum and WNET Group on this screening, which is part of WNET's Holocaust Days of Remembrance series, exploring anti-Semitism through the history and personal stories of the Holocaust. Sir Simon Schama is a historian and television presenter who is a professor of history and art history at Columbia University. Journalist, editor, and author Tina Brown is the former editor-in-chief of Tatler, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, and the founding editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast. She is the author of the Diana Chronicles, the Vanity Fair Diaries, and Palace Papers. After this evening's conversation, there will be time for audience Q&A. Thank you for coming this evening and enjoy the screening.
Let's give another round of applause to Simon Schama. And welcome to Tina Brown. Thank you for being here.
Well, this is quite a hard interview to do because this is a film that has left, I think, us all wordless. But somehow we have to find the words to discuss it. I've seen it before, but it has left me even more shaken this time, I have to say. I noticed even more. Simon has made, I think, what is it, Simon, over the last 25 years, more than a dozen films?
60.
16, my God. But obviously, The Road to Auschwitz is his most personal film yet, because while he's written about the Holocaust, this is the time that he came to the decision that he had to confront the monster, as he calls it, and go and intrude upon that sacred ground where millions of Jews were tormented and exterminated. And his courage, I think, in doing so and sharing such deeply human responses makes you understand the Holocaust as never before, if it is possible to understand, which it really isn't. But welcome, Simon. It's great that you're here.
Thank you, Gina.
So you've studied Jewish history for so long, yet this was still for you a journey of discovery in so many ways. I mean, in all this incredible emotional and scholarly work that you've done on this film, what really did surprise you the most, if you had to kind of pick the thing that you really took away that changed your feelings about it or your understanding of it?
Well, it's a terrible word to use, and you're right to introduce the problem of words. I would just preface my answer by saying that there were lots of times, really, when I was in Birkenau, but also in that awful car park in Kovno in Kaunas, where I just didn't want to say anything at all. Words seem banal and almost disrespectful in a way. So a piece of me just wanted the archive to play, but I did realize there was a duty of being a kind of interlocutor, I suppose, and particularly restoring specific human presences of Oenig Shabbos and Gela Seckstein and Zalman Grodowski, the Sonderkommando. So, I mean, a part of, but the question about being surprised, the word I was going to use, which is why I did that little preface, because sometimes words seem to be so jarring, but I would use the word versatility of the Holocaust. That's to say, extraordinarily kind of evil genius of adapting particular kind of tactics to, particular places which are quite different. Lithuania and the Netherlands were completely different, and they kind of understood that. And again, the sort of subtext of surprise was there are places where the Shoah did not come step by step. I mean, in Lithuania, we're talking days after the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in the end of June 1941. So it comes exploding out of the gate, and it's thought of and sort of engineered tactically in a very particular way by Heinrich Himmler and Heydrich in particular, that there would be 3 phases. And the first phase is to use local nationalist partisans, in this case Lithuanian partisans, who were all freed from prison. They've been locked up by the communist regime. And one of those prisoners was the man you saw with this enormous iron bar leading this massacre in broad daylight. And to have a kind of pogrom, not a kind of pogrom, a pogrom, which not only was the rabbi of Slobodka the first to be murdered, but displayed as a kind of bloodlust incitement. And actually, his body, his head, was set on the Gemara, which he'd actually been studying when his house was broken open. So you start with this kind of implosion of almost unbelievable violence. And then you use that as the pretext to say to Jews and to fellow citizens, this cannot go on like this, so we need to have a ghetto in the interests of civil peace. Once the ghetto was established, then you knew exactly where everybody was, and you could plan the timing of not only deportations, but mass executions long before the gas chambers were ready. So sorry, I know I'm going on I do. That's why I was really so overwhelmed by what happened at the 9th Fort, where the commandant of Einsatzkommando A man called Stahlecker, decided arbitrarily, it's a neat figure, that 10,000 would be a nice round number to execute in a day and a half. And it happens just in a day and a half like that. And we're in the autumn of 1941. So an immense story, of horror and genius, really, was in a time not associated with Auschwitz and Treblinka and Sobibor.
Well, I mean, what of course is just constantly a sort of refrain is just, I mean, in Lithuania until the late 40s, those communities were always integrated, respected the Jewish community. I mean, the way you sort of paint this kind of very kind of pleasant, existence of social clubs and ice skating and all the things that were going on. And I don't understand, and obviously the film puzzles at this constantly, but to explain in more detail that sort of alchemy, of evil that triggers this change. I mean, it's so inconceivable that this happy, congenial, this integrated society can change into this scene of such savagery.
Yeah, well, it's profoundly disturbing. I wouldn't quite use the word integrated. In the countryside of Lithuania, my family, my mother's family, the Steinbergs, in fact, did not come from Kovno, from Kaunas itself, but they were timber people, as my father and my mother like to say, about 30 or 40 kilometers into the woods northwest of Kovno. But the 2 great cities, Jerusalem of the north, Vilna, which had been Polish for most of the interwar period, and Kaunas, Kovno, again, a bit like Warsaw. It's quite true that you could find Jews in the professions, in the arts, those 5 newspapers, and so on. So it was a kind of sort of dream, really, well, dream is too much, but it was a very lively and vital coexistence. In the countryside, however, it would be wrong to think of really the world of the Jews and the world of Lithuanians as integrated. They live side by side with each other.
Yeah.
Well, yes, they certainly, yes. I mean, there is a mutuality. The country laborers and farmers and tenant farmers produce goods, and Jews sell them at the market and so on. And Jews, there's a very large percentage of them in manufacturing textiles and so on. So it's workable. It's not even like Poland, and certainly not like the Ukraine, where you expect pogrom after pogrom. It is rather extraordinary and even more upsetting that there's one big pogrom in a relatively small town in Lithuania in 1938. There are political parties that are rabidly anti-Semitic, in Poland, not in Lithuania. Yes, there is a fiercely anti-Semitic ultra-nationalist party called the Iron Wolves, but they don't have tremendously much. Unlike Romania, for example, they don't have very much purchase in the politics of interwar Lithuania. Yet, when the lever is pulled,
and the lever was the Nazis.
Pardon?
The lever was the Nazis, you say, or the lever was just.
Oh, I think the Germans are pulling the lever, and there are enough Lithuanians who are like the Iron Wolves who want to use the moment to rid Lithuania of the Jews, and they're described in the usual way that goes back again hundreds of years. They're an infection, they're biologically malignant, they own everything, they don't have any loyalty, and so on. All those cliches that you go right back to, not just the Middle Ages, but actually to the Roman Empire. You can read that all in Tacitus. That all then becomes the rhetoric of incitement. So it is like that woman with the tooth, I doubt she thought of herself as an anti-Semite. So is everybody else. And the one thing which, again, we didn't have time to deal with, and we're trying to have a longer film, is that both Saulius Berežinis and I briefly talked about, it's an empire of plunder too. It's not just gold teeth. It's clothes, it's possessions, it's furniture. You saw that happening in Amsterdam as well. So everybody has something to gain, and as they are participating in this horrifying empire of plunder, somewhere like in the middle of Ponau Forest, there was a jump nonetheless of witnessing what happened in that car park square. There's a jump nonetheless of, in broad daylight, seeing thousands after thousands after thousands of Jews massacred, being shot in the back of the neck. Layers in the pits in Ponau were 15 layers of bodies high. And then Lithuanians and Germans together had a kind of sadistic creativity. A trampoline was actually set over one of the pits at Ponau Forest so that the naked, helpless Jewish victims were forced to bounce up and down on the trampoline so they could be shot in midair, as in a kind of fairground. Children were very seldom shot. They were just thrown and smothered in a layer of bodies. So the horror is like the Stanford experiments. It's actually how regular folk in the streets turned into bystanders and then into participants.
Well, that, of course, is what is most terrifying. But I guess for me, the real kind of surprise, which I've never heard of before, essentially, was, with the idea of the Nazis' planes, flying over and taking pictures, this kind of sinister sense that they were sort of feeling that they were doing the bidding of the people who wanted them to do it. It was like, rather than the Germans kind of forcing them, which is what I had always thought, that this was an enforced situation on the Jews. Right. It was more that they were behaving, we can liberate you to be what you want to be, which is anti-Semitic. Yeah. And then we will stoke it, and they did.
Well, Hitler had read Henry Ford, I mean, the most venomous, terrifying notion of the Jews as a kind of vermin that needed exterminating. That's why I'm quite tough on, saying this was the Germans were the the means of execution. They were enthusiastic executioners, no doubt about that. And Christopher Browning's wonderful work, which a lot of you, I'm sure, know, shows how much, for example, the German police, as well as the SS police, actually, some people actually volunteered for the executions in Lithuania. There are terrifying stories of actually, there was one Einsatzkommando captain who actually said to his officers, if you don't want to do this, I'll allow you to take leave, you know. And it was a group of about 100 or so, and 3 of them didn't want to do it. The rest participated, went right along with it.
I mean, obviously, the horrific moment of the gold tooth that you've mentioned, perhaps the most horrific part was that she still had the gold tooth.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, she, and says, well, no, they were a living person, came out of a living person. So, is it still there lurking, this beast?
I can hear you all sigh. We all think it is. I mean, that's to say, you know, catastrophes come in their own particular shape and size and demonic fury. But if the line, without, I think, getting into, I'm about to give a talk like this in Wales, actually, in a few days, where I'm sure the first word out of someone's mouth will probably be Gaza. But the line you cross is when you have a complaint or a criticism of Netanyahu, I'm one of his fiercest critics, or of what the Israeli, or what the IDF is doing, and the line you cross is to say, well, this is how the Jews are. What else is to be expected from the Jews? 80% of Jews love Israel. 80% of Jews are committed to the existence of Israel. It doesn't mean to say they're in love with Benjamin Netanyahu and necessarily the conduct of the war. But you cross the line which allows you to show a caricature of Benjamin Netanyahu with his teeth sunk into the body of a baby and blood dripping from it. And that's, again, not a Nazi invention. That goes back to the blood libel invented in the 12th century in England. So that's the sort of sense in which really, for some of us, you know, who thought we knew better as historians, heavy set of air quotes, it was like some of the things that were said and done after October the 7th were like peeling back a rug, and under the rug instead of a floor was a kind of verminous, awful, writhing pool of psychopathic hatred, really. I'm famous for my understatement, as you all know.
Well, I was going to say that you talk about...
I just want to add one thing, Tina, is that I think what happened to historiography is extremely interesting of the Holocaust. You can go to, which of course is immense, and very, very powerful and extraordinary. And there was a kind of consensus even 10 years ago, certainly 15 years ago, that partly because survivors were dying, we had distance from the Shoah, and it be treated like other historical phenomena, the Black Death or the First World War, or something like that. And we could, you know, carefully analyze cause and effect and join all the dots up. And then actually what happened, I think, since, you know, it happened really, you know, before October the 7th, but there was a terrible, painful realization that there'd never been as much Holocaust education, museums, school trips, all this, you know, buses of school kids coming to Auschwitz, and anti-Semitism was growing rather than actually, you know, shrinking, really. So, but there, above all, there was the sense, actually, that the narrative of the Holocaust defied, that's what I said right at the beginning of the film. I didn't know quite how much I would kind of live through it being true. But there was that the normal analytical tools of the historian were really inadequate to achieve the task of bringing people into the heart of horror, into not looking away, as Salman Grodowski said. Jean Amery, the Belgian writer and political philosopher who was a survivor of Auschwitz but who committed suicide, and who's monstrously been kind of co-opted by the most extreme anti-Zionists like Pankaj Mishra, because he criticized Israel torturing Palestinian prisoners as Mishra and others thought in way back in Amery. We're talking about in the 1970s. Jean-Luc Amery said, when he got around to describing Auschwitz. And Primo Levi says something, even Primo Levi, the scientist, with his limpid, cool, scientific mind. But Améry says, I actually don't want clarity. I don't want clarity. I'm not doing this for clarity, least of all my own clarity. I'm doing it, in effect, he says, for reality, to sort of actually bring people into the kind of actual material horror and monstrosity of it all. And as you know, I was very struck by two very good movies lately, famous movies. The Zone of Interest, Jonathan Glazer's brilliant film, and Steve McQueen's also very interesting, long, 4-hour documentary called Occupied City, set in Amsterdam, where all you see is contemporary Amsterdam, and you hear a very dispassionate voice describing who was taken from which house and where Jews were rounded up in Amsterdam. But in both those films, they're completely Jew-free. You don't see or hear from Jews at all. And Jonathan Glazer said, well, we've made a soundscape, which he indeed did, but the obsession was with the psychology of the perpetrators, fine. But it seemed to me that something else was needed, and that was the voices I read.
I actually feel that your film is like a companion piece to the Zone of Interest, because the Zone of Interest is, obviously, as you say, Jew-free, and you just see the smokes, the chimneys. And
right.
What your film is, of course, is what was happening in those chimneys. You talked about something you call the enormity gap, the difficulty of finding the tools to describe the indescribable. I mean, historians play such an important role, don't they, in the whole Holocaust situation, because without those brave, those brave chroniclers, who sort of hid their work and who were determined that we should have this evidence, we wouldn't know nearly as much. I'm actually quite fascinated as well by the pictures. I mean, who was taking these photographs, actually?
Well, overwhelmingly, those are German photographers, but
right.
there is somebody whose pictures we didn't use, actually, except I think one or two of them. There's an extraordinary man in Kovno, in Kaunas, called George Kaddish, probably know. In fact, I think some of the Kaddish photos here. They almost certainly are, because I think they end up in NYU. George Kaddish was, it's extraordinary. He created a camera that he could, in the Kovno ghetto, that he sewed into his finely tailored, heavy Lithuanian overcoat, and actually shot the images through the buttonhole. It was an extraordinary early militarized camera. And that was astonishing. And in fact, actually, he had enough photographs to actually mount the very first photographic exhibition of what the Holocaust had been for American and British troops in 1945. It became a kind of traveling exhibition. So he was really remarkable. The other very famous set of photographs, 4 of them, which are in the BBC version, but we had to, alas, cut for time for the PBS version, were taken by Sonderkommandos in Auschwitz at that moment that we describe in the summer of 1944. And film was smuggled in by women who were working in the industrial part of Birkenau, and a camera was amongst the plunder when people had to deposit their sad little suitcases when they came to the selection ramp, and then they were sorted into this notorious enormous warehouse called Canada in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So they got their camera, they got their film. The only place they could take photographs, and what they're photographs of, is what I described, namely of gassed bodies, which could the crematoria could no longer consume. So you had these kind of open fire pits, that are monstrous, enormous fire pits in the open air. So one of those photographs is of hundreds and hundreds of naked, dead bodies on the rim of one of those fire pits. Another one, which is very upsetting,
and that was taken sort of surreptitiously.
They were taken, yes, they had to be, obviously. It was, they were taken, the only place where the SS guards wouldn't see them, which again you see in one of the prints, they're kept in the Auschwitz archive on the side, is inside the doorway to the gas chamber. In other words, you're looking and you see an arch, and then beyond it are those bodies by the lip of the rim of the fire pit. So they're taking them from inside because they were trusted by the SS to that extent anyway. And Gradowski and his comrades, both men and women, the women were found actually and hanged, but Gradowski was one of the leaders of the Auschwitz uprising in October, I think I'm pretty sure it's first week of October 1944, and dies, having first buried everything under a tree near the Sonderkommando. Any opportunity was seized, and to speak to your earlier, the point you just made, what is really extraordinary, I mean, we have this tradition in Judaism of Zachor, which is recited on Seder nights in respect of remembering the Exodus, the Passover. But this kind of urge for memory, Judaism has never been a religion that endured through buildings and monuments, or even synagogues. Yes, grand synagogues are built in the 19th century and 20th century, but essentially it's always been a religion of the portable word. So whether or not our writers are religious or not, Chaim Kaplan came from a very ultra-Orthodox background. Chaim Kaplan was the voice you heard in the Warsaw Ghetto, not part of Oyneg Shabbos actually, but very friendly towards them. He was a teacher of modern Hebrew, and he says over and over again he must have his words survive. Same with Gradowski. That Gradowski it's an extraordinary book. The sheer literary quality is overwhelming. He actually writes a lot of his it's not a book, it's sort of a set of manuscripts, and a lot of it's written in the second person. And it says, "Come with me into this place," meaning the gas chamber and the crematory. Come with me. It's almost kind of Dante-like in a way.
Did you find any sort of commonality of the triggering between these places? I mean,
oh, sorry.
Well,
yes.
no. I mean, it's just obviously one gets back again to the changes in these places that made them turn on their neighbors and do these things in country after country. Is there anything?
No,
triggering. When he says at the end, the one who died, about the Holocaust comes in gloves, and
right.
it comes bit
step by
bit,
step,
step by step.
Yes.
Sort of sinister thought. Are there kind of steps that you saw? Okay, this is one step. This is another step. We're on our way.
No, I mean, we deliberately, in less than an hour, we deliberately chose quite contrasting experiences, particularly. The experience of the Holocaust in the Netherlands could not be more different than the experience in Lithuania, where it just explodes bloodily. Right. The Nazis, saw what the society was like. The Dutch were famous for their institutional efficiency, really, in a slightly different way. I mean, one of the most horrifying things is that the Germans know they cannot understand why the Dutch historically have been so friendly towards the Jews, but they did understand with a kind of diabolical genius that historical situation in which the Dutch refused to believe that those who'd been their neighbors, there never was really there was a Jewish quarter, but only because you needed to be able to walk to synagogue on Shabbat and on the high holy days. There was never historically ever. In fact, there was a debate in the 17th century about whether a condition of accepting Jews who were coming from Spain and Portugal, and whether they should be confined to a place like the Venetian Ghetto, and everywhere that was decided, no, that's not going to happen. There should be no identifying clothes for Jews. So Jews really were inseparable from the rest, particularly in Amsterdam. Were there, bad jokes made about Jews? Absolutely, of course there were, but actually, essentially, it was a kind of neighborly Jewish world. So Germans understood that and used it really, particularly, they could have gone, they were very harsh after the Starking, the general strike in 1941, but they used it really to sustain the belief that when, for example, it was done in 2 steps, again, something we didn't have time for in the film. First of all, this was similar to Poland, was similar to what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. Jews from the countryside, from smaller towns, Groningen in the north, and so on, or Middelburg in Zeeland, they were all brought to Amsterdam. But where they then went to in Amsterdam, the kind of collection point was not like the kind of horrifically brutal Umschlagplatz that you saw on the Warsaw deportation. It was to a theatre, which had been called, and now is called again, the Hollandse Schouwburg. The Holland, the Dutch theatre, which then became known as the Joodse Schouwburg, the Jewish theatre. And there, in that theatre, it was surrounded, and still is, by apartments. And the neighbors and the apartments sometimes recognized Jewish friends to whom they waved. And there are photographs taken by those non-Jewish neighbors of cups of coffee, of someone tuning up a violin. There's one absolutely heartbreaking. If we do get to make our 90-minute film, which I really hope we will, this is a photograph I really want to use. There's a young woman, I've forgotten her name, but she sees one of her best friends, she's in her 20s, sitting on the balcony of the flat overlooking the courtyard, which was at the back of the theatre. And she waves. It's a photograph of her face wreathed in smiles, waving to her friend.
And she knew she knew what was happening to her.
They did not know. They thought no, again, very successfully. At that point, so we're talking about the summer and autumn of 1941, even into early 1942, they were told they were going to a work camp in the Netherlands in the north, which was Westerbork, in the north of the Netherlands, and it was from Westerbork that they'd be deported to Auschwitz. So in fact, this young woman, feeling still in some sense a connection with her friends, it was 3 days later she's on the train to Westerbork.
Right, unbelievable. I was also very disturbed when you said it would have absolutely happened had they crossed the channel. And
yeah.
I mean, do you really, I mean, I that had never occurred to me. I mean, it somehow felt I would never have expected that to happen in Britain, essentially.
Well, people didn't expect it to happen in the Netherlands,
I know,
too.
well, that's what's so horrendous about
Yeah.
it. I mean, was there any sense...
People were doing their jobs. Jacobus
Yeah.
Lenz, who invented that identity card, was just really doing his job, you know. What was fatal for the Jews in the Netherlands, because all transport connections are very, close. It's a small country. There are no forests as there are in Eastern Europe in which to hide. The Jews expected institutional neutrality. Instead, they were up against institutional complicity. And, we're sitting, the Anne Frank exhibition, of course, is here, where there were 30,000 Unterdrückers. There were 30,000 hidden Jews. But there were 12,000 of those 30,000, like Anne Frank, who were betrayed.
Right.
And now, of course, yes, and the list of likely collaborators has been digitized. These were people who were examined, and his case histories were studied in the late 1940s. And they've been digitized, and there's a huge, deeply tortured debate going on. I mean, these records were supposed to be made public, and they're not yet been made public, but it's pretty likely they will be. If you go, if any of you have been or any of you have not been, the Holocaust Museum, the new Holocaust Museum in Amsterdam is absolutely remarkable. It only has one fault, it's too small, needed to be bigger, but it is in a particular site near the Hollandse Schouwburg, and it's remarkable, and it's very fierce. It's savage in its self-criticism and self-interrogation. The NSB, the Dutch Nazis, were a tiny number. So actually for the system to go smoothly, depended really, again, on this institutional neutrality, people just doing their job, making sure the railways ran. The railway
So
to
it's
Westerbork.
a deadly passivity, really.
Yes. Exactly. So why
yeah.
would that not happen in a place like
Well,
Britain?
I guess that's true. I mean, one likes to think that it would.
Well, there was much more of a Nazi-sympathetic mass movement in Britain
Yes,
than there was
yeah.
in Holland, in the Mosleyite
Right.
moment.
No, and you talk about, which I found sort of chilling, courage shriveled. I mean, that it was, after the crackdown, it
Right.
shriveled. And I guess that's where, of course, the Nazis' violence was so frightening that people, we don't know, we probably do from all the writing that you've read and so on, how many people were complicit but appalled. I mean, were they appalled when they were complicit, or were they just doing it because they were afraid, or were they just shrugging?
Well, I don't know. I mean, well, we need to look at the responses to the examination, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, all of the above, I think,
Yeah.
really, from
Yeah.
case to case.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So-
some believe this was going to be the new order, like it or not. You know.
Indeed. So, of course, this film, as you say, it's 60 minutes.
I will say, sorry, I'll just add one
Yeah.
thing, is that very often in occupied countries or even in allied countries like Italy, one of the most telling debates happens within the church. And the Calvinist church, on the whole, behaved very well in the Netherlands, although it was divided. It's always a debate, the most famous of all happens in Italy during the papacy of Pius XII, between two crucial cardinals, Montini, who'll become Paul VI, and Pacelli, who'll become John XXIII. And the debate is always about the same thing. Is the most important thing the survival of the church, which was Montini's position, and Pacelli's position, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to save lives. So Pius XII, in his kind of beady-eyed way, said, well, I'm not going to issue whatever it is, proclamation against what the Germans are doing, but I will allow the priesthood to do individually what priests want to do. And a very large number of priests were extraordinarily brave and benevolent in Italy.
I mean, obviously, to cram all this into 60 minutes, I know you have a slightly longer version with the BBC, but what have you left out of this film that you really wish that you could have been able to show us?
So much. I mean, I think there are,
Are there any critical sort of points that you couldn't make?
Oh, points I couldn't make. I think. No, I think in terms of the arguments I wanted to make, I probably, at the Esprit de Scalier or something, when we go home night, I'll think of all kinds of extra points I'd want to make. But I actually, in terms of, the realization of what it was like to be a Jewish human in the midst of all this, needed longer with the voices. And for example, am I allowed to do the little bit of reading? Do we have time for that?
Definitely.
One of the, since we've got Anne Frank here, the other, how many, probably a lot of you have heard of Etty Hillesum, have you? Hands up, class. Not many of you, but I hope, yes. So she is, Anne Frank was absolutely destined to be a great writer. There's no, I think, doubt in my mind about that. But she, of course, the usable Anne Frank, as Dara Horn has eloquently written in her devastating book called People Love Dead Jews, it's uncharacteristic to think of in my heart, despite everything I believe people are good. I mean, the last months of Anne Frank's writing are dark and angry and often despairing as well. And there is a young woman in her 20s called Etty Hillesum, daughter of teachers, graduate student in Amsterdam in 1941, a very kind of exuberant sex life, having an affair with two people, one of whom she's deeply in love with, who's a kind of odd psychotherapist, Jewish, called Julia Speyer. And then when actually she works as a secretary, has a job as a secretary for the Joodse the Jewish council in Amsterdam, which lets her go to Westerbork, the transit camp, and go back to Amsterdam. She finds religion, oddly enough, in an increasingly godless moment, and she becomes a profound and extraordinary writer who somehow, all of them I wanted to say actually about the people I was talking about before, like Chaim Kaplan, there is a point where they all accept death. And she says specifically, that's not what I want to read, but she says, I know I'm going to die, and it's very hard to explain this, but it's given me a stronger sense of life than I've ever had before. And life is poured into just astounding writing. And just to give you a sense, because I think I'm her, she would have been a really astonishing writer. And she's describing the departure of a transport from Westerbork. She dies in Auschwitz. She could actually probably have gone into hiding, but she has a younger brother called Misha, who's seriously he's he almost schizophrenic, actually, has sort of serious mental problems. She stays and she goes to Auschwitz with her parents and dies in 1943, I think. So here she's just describing, to give you a sense, actually, of how when they are writing, they're writing with extraordinary kind of brilliant exactness. Here's the commandant arriving. He now walks along the train. The train is ready to depart with military precision. A relatively young man who has arrived early in his career, if one may call it that. He's an absolute master over the life and death of Dutch and German Jews here on this remote heath in Drenthe province. A year ago, he probably had not the slightest idea so much as existed. I didn't know about it myself, to tell you the truth. He walks along the train, his grey, immaculately brushed hair showing just beneath his flat, light green cap. That grey hair, which makes such a romantic contrast with his young face, sends many of the silly young girls here into raptures, though they dare not, of course, express their feelings openly. On this cruel morning, his face is almost iron grey. It's a face I'm quite unable to read. Sometimes it seems to me like a long, thin scar, in which grimness mingles with joylessness and hypocrisy. And there's something else about him, halfway between a dapper hairdresser's assistant and a stage door Johnny. But the grimness and the force bearing predominate. With military step, he walks along the line of freight cars, bulging now with people. He's inspecting his troops, the sick, infants in arms, young mothers, shaven-headed men. A few more ailing people are being brought up on stretchers. He makes an impatient gesture. They're taking too long. And so on.
This is incredible writing.
It is, absolutely.
How did this writing come to be? I mean, is she on that train?
She's not on that train, but she will be on a train. She sent copies of, these are all letters to her friends and her diary. And again, because she has slightly more freedom to go back and forth to Amsterdam until she decides to stay to the end at Westerbork. She actually throws a postcard out of the train she is on, not the one I've just read, and miraculously it's found and picked up, and that's the last we hear from Etty.
It's amazing. I mean, before we go to questions, is there one character that you particularly took to your heart in this film? I mean, there's so many, obviously, and you speak about each of them so movingly, but is there one that you feel? Well,
her really.
Yeah.
I've sort of been in love with her for years.
Yes.
Really. But I also think Grodowski is an extraordinary man, and it's very hard to know what one should feel about Jewish Sonderkommandos, isn't it? I haven't seen Son of Saul. I mustn't I? And it was interesting. The director of Son of Saul was the one who was also rather upset by what Jonathan Glazer did. But Grodowski, the Sonderkommando live in slightly better barracks, are given better food. And of course, they're all going to be shot. They all know they're going to die. They have no illusions about surviving the war at all. But, then Grodowski leads us, again, what Dara Horn says is that Anne Frank, in all the, extraordinary kind of vitality of what she does, is... she's not, of course she's swallowed up in Belsen and dies, but she's actually not writing from the heart of the Holocaust. She's writing from the Achterhuis. Here, Grodowski is writing from the absolutely epicenter of horror. Mm-hmm. And Dara says, well, it's not surprising no one's heard of Salman Grodowski, because it's very, very hard to take the reality of it. So, all these people I talked about, Kaplan, Gela Seckstein, there's someone we didn't feature in the film at all, who is the survivor of Oyinok Shaba. She does actually survive. She's a very good writer called Rachel Auerbach. And she's absolutely remarkable too. There's so many remarkable people. There's a young woman who joins Oyinok Shaba called Gustava Jarecki, who describes her writing and all the writing and all the witness wonderfully as a stone hurled beneath the wheel of history.
Oh,
I do wish I'd use that really.
Yeah,
And
it's great.
so you do feel more than ever, you absolutely feel you know these people very, very well.
Well,
how
that is
they
what
walked,
your film does.
how they
Simon,
laughed, how they cried.
Well,
You know.
that's what your film does. I mean, you humanize it all so incredibly movingly. I would love to now go to some questions in the audience. We have some time. Would you, others over here?
I asked Elie Wiesel whether he
Yeah.
thought the Holocaust was qualitatively different from what man has been doing to his fellow man since the beginning of time. He said yes, but I'm thinking of the Armenian massacre. I'm thinking of 1.5 million Jews killed in the First and Second Roman Wars, 20 million in the Belgian Congo. So do you think it's qualitative? Is there something about it that's unique in human history?
Well, it's a powerful question, but it's very extremely difficult to answer because I don't know what the metric of qualitative differentiation could possibly be. No, absolutely. It's in the intention. The intention is, as Hitler made no bones about it in 1939, you know, if the Jews start another war, there'll be no Jews left, really. And so the sense in which actually you absolutely plan by every means possible to leave no Jews left in the world. That, you know, there were concentration camps in Libya and Tunisia as well. If, in fact, El Alamein had gone the other way, there was already an SS planning group in Egypt before El Alamein, and in Italian Libya, planning what might be done with the Jews of Palestine. So that seems to me, you know, maybe there was somebody planning who sat down at the desk and said, we don't want any more Armenians, but I rather doubt that, actually. Was the actual nature of the massacre horrifying to an extraordinary belief? Yes, it was. But I you know, historians always stand to be corrected, at least they also do. But in my sense, the actual, you know, again, as I said in the film, it was extraordinary, someone like Eichmann, for example, at a time when it was quite clear that the Germans were going to lose the war, nonetheless felt with a kind of demonic sense of job satisfaction that he had to go through with the entirety of the annihilation of the Hungarian Jews. So in the end, I would agree with Elie Wiesel, I think.
I just want to ask the flip side of that, which is, given all of this that we supposedly know from history, why is anti-Semitism increasing and still exist after this irrefutable horror?
Right. Well, do you know a book by David Nirenberg, a Princeton professor along at Chicago, called Anti-Judaism, which is a really extraordinary and remarkable book. And Nirenberg's point, which looks over, he actually begins in classical antiquity, but his point is that the Jews have been needed, not phobia about Jews is not just kind of an add-on to Christian society, or indeed sometimes Muslim society. You know, I mean, the Jews of the Jews of Arabia are famously massacred, and Yathrib, you know, becomes Medina. But on and on, you know, if you're a Bolshevik, Jews are capitalists. If you're an ultra-capitalist like Henry Ford, the Jews are Bolshevik. No, I'm just saying, I know, I'm coming to that, sorry, in my classical way of slightly beating around the bush. So Jews as the opposite of what you want to be are useful now because the campus cult is of decolonization. And particularly, it's particularly obsessive in nations like Australia and Canada, and which are themselves, you know, products of a colonial system. What is really astounding is that Israel and Jews who are Zionists, meaning just believe that Israel has a right to exist, a legitimate right to exist, are taken as the paradigm of what's called settler colonialism. And, the notion that you could, Jews in Palestine had no, unlike the definition of a colonial society is you've got somewhere to go back to. You've got a metropolitan home to go back to. The definition of a colonial society is that you're completely divorced from the language and the ancestral culture of the place you decide to be in, like the British in India, for example. Whereas, the Hebrew spoken now, yes, Ivrit is kind of reinvented by Ben Yehuda, but it is identical with what you and I can read the Dead Sea Scrolls, if we know some Hebrew and read it right through. It's the same language. The archaeology, we are indigenous to this place. So it is totally a product of absurdity and ignorance, really, to actually demonize all of Jews who do want Israel to exist as arch-imperialist colonizers, really. And a lot of the urge in campuses, which I'm very familiar as a university professor, is to exonerate your own, is to turn the Jews into ultra-white people. Nobody who's ever walked down a street in Tel Aviv could think Israel as a supremely white place. But the notion is that you want to really live a life of indignant virtue, and therefore you're seeking, so it lands, always lands on the heads of Jews.
Just to follow up, the other half of that is the people who are not feeling, indignant, self-justified, because the people who are running things now, what's his name, Joe Rogan the other day,
Yeah.
supported Kanye West, and
Yeah.
how large an audience does he have?
Millions. Yes, that's incredible. Well, that's a different point, and probably we don't want to go in lengthily about, no, but they're both very good ones, and that's the other side of it, way outside the campus world, the world of Joe Rogan and the world of Tucker Carlson, both of whom gave platform time to a man called Darryl Cooper, who Tucker Carlson described as the most significant popular historian. He described himself as a truth teller who was an out-and-out Holocaust denier, The fame notoriously said Churchill was the real villain and the Holocaust was just a kind of public health measure to deal with typhus and so on. So, there's an inverse relation, Tina knows all about this, between actually the authority of opinionating and the vast, immeasurable, abyss-like chasm of ignorance, really. You don't actually need to know anything in order to be, in that world, authoritative and be, quote, an influencer. And that is an absolutely, you're right, it may be, the implication, more deadly, more fatal, more alarming, really, than campus cults about Jews as colonialists.
I think we have room for 2 more questions, so let's go for you first and then you.
Hi, congratulations on a wonderful movie. I've been to Ukraine 4 times in the last 2 years and learned the history there of the Holocaust by bullets that took place just a couple months after Lithuania's at a scale probably 20 times larger, 1.5 million Jews murdered there, most infamously at Babi Yar. And I was wondering whether the war there precluded you from including Ukraine in your movie, whether you would compare how you would compare Ukraine's history during the Holocaust to, say, Lithuania and Romania's.
It's quite close, really. I mean, because I know Odessa, I filmed in Odessa when we were making the story of the Jews. I feel and we spent quite a long time in Odessa. So, but the whole history of the Romanian occupation of Odessa and what happened to the Jewish population in gigantic numbers very quickly. No, it was just a matter of one thing you learn in the kind of TV trade is that too many stories, too many characters actually are confusing, and confusion, sorry to be so media like this, confusion is always the herald of boredom, actually, and not boredom, but it doesn't work. So we had to make really ferocious decisions about what we, exemplary cases that are all different, which is why we really went Lithuania, Warsaw, the Netherlands and then back to Auschwitz. But it's obviously a kind of quite, the sense really of that the engineering of pogroms followed by ghettoization, followed by deportation is similar. So again, the one thing actually Tina asked me what I missed out and was going to be, I think briefly actually does happen in the BBC version. In fact, I know it does, because Marian Turski had a very moving account, was the death marches. And there's also again, something else that I wanted to be in the film is 1946, in a way, what happened to survivors. I mean, in Netherlands, it was absolutely, some appalling things happened. People were actually charged mortgage arrears and back tax payments for the time they'd spent in the camps, which this wasn't true. But it is actually true. Yeah, astonishing. And of course, there was a terrifying pogrom in Kielce in Poland in 1946. Yeah.
Was it this one? Yes, this gentleman.
Hello. Oh, hi. One particularly insidious phenomenon has been the abuse of the term genocide, which was coined for the Shoah, following the Shoah, in order to capture something of the uniqueness of the horror. I'd just be curious, because now it's batted around like it's meaningless, and perhaps you could comment on that. It just seems so...
Yeah, I'm sensitive to that, I do think some terrible things have happened in Gaza, from which the Israeli government is not entirely exempt. Again, I really do not want to get into that. But it's true that, when I saw, for example, which doesn't quite meet your point, but when I saw actually anti-vax demonstrators in Trafalgar Square during COVID wearing a yellow star on their coats, I thought the whole kind of sense of the devaluation of this term, really, of the utility of invoking the Shoah. I wasn't very happy when, again, Israeli representatives in the United Nations arrived wearing yellow stars. I thought that was actually in some weird way disrespectful. But I think, there is the storm of madness and tragedy engulfing us, all the time. Makes it quite difficult, really. I'm sure I will get this, actually, when I talk about this in Britain. But actually, whatever you want to say about what Israel is doing in Gaza, is it the same thing as what we've seen? No, it absolutely is not.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to,
That's all the time we have this evening.
We have to wind it here.
Let's thank Simon Schama so very much. And Tina Brown, thank you all for being here. Have a good night.